Hi everyone, good morning. Welcome to the 87th Learn with Lorna. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, as I say, the 87th in the series. My name is Lorna, I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. If you've watched before, you'll know the Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres. We have the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness. We have Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and Skye and Lochash Archive Centre in Portree. And those 4 make up the Highland Archive Service, telling stories, looking after collections that date back hundreds of years from the Highlands history and also the Highlands present as well, which we also collect. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. If you're able to donate towards our work, then there's a link to be able to do so both here and on YouTube, and I'd be very grateful if you were able to do that. First of all, apologies for last week's slightly dodgy quality when it was going out live. I know it was subsequently absolutely fine. If you watch it back now, it's completely fine. So that was because I was in work, as you now know, for the staff awards. So the other thing I wanted to say before I start talking about this week's is thank you so much for all your lovely, lovely comments about the fact that our team got a team commendation from High Life Highland and also that got an individual award. I'm under strict instructions to show it to you. So this is the individual award. And then also we all got our commendation certificates as well. So thank you so much for your lovely comments. I'm so glad that the series has meant so much to so many people. I'm very proud of it. And I love the collections and I love sharing them with you. So thank you for all your lovely, lovely messages. I spoke about the court records back in August 2020. So a long time ago, and we're revisiting the court records for today's talk as the final one in our Crime and Punishment month of talks. I'll give you a whistle-stop tour of what the collection consists of before I go into some of the specific documents and the specific stories. The collection of court papers that we look after comprises the process papers of various types of court in the Highlands. So the main court records are held in Edinburgh in the National Records of Scotland, but we hold process papers. So things like statements, sentences of banishment and so on, but I'll come on and talk about that as we go. So I mentioned that there are different levels of courts and different types of courts. So what were those courts and what did they deal with? Well, the main series that we have are the Borough Court records, the Sheriff Court and the High Court. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those as we go. But also we hold records of the Justice of the Peace Court, so the JP Court, the Court of Session, the Commissary Court, the High Court of Admiralty, the Court of Exchequer, and the Courts of Regality and Barony. And all of those have slightly different remits. They all deal with different types of crime and different types of punishment. But I'm going to start with the Borough Court because this is a court that we have the most for. We have literally thousands of documents from the Borough Court series. And this is the court that usually dealt with the most minor offences committed in royal boroughs. So things like, for instance, absence from guard duty, theft of fruit, very much like if you remember in the police records, the constant stealing of vegetables. And we have stealing of fruit in the borough records. Allowing boundary walls to deteriorate and fall on and damage the neighbouring people's property. So things like that, they're quite often quite minor and things that are happening within the royal boroughs. But they're not always minor, the Borough Court. And so I'm going to look at some examples of stories that are contained within these Borough Court records. First of all, the story of Alex Fisher, the comedian, which appears in the Borough Court records of 1769. I was really interested, actually. I don't know why I was so surprised, but to find 2 documents relating to 2 different comedians in the Borough Court papers from the 1700s. And of course, we know that there would have been entertainers and people travelling around the countryside and putting on shows. But it was just interesting to me to see two different people both termed as comedian, both in the court papers, which doesn't reflect well on the profession. So I'm going to start with Alex Fisher's story. Now, Alex Fisher petitioned the borough court. So that's one of the types of document we have, is a petition of someone writing to the court to ask for help or support or something. And he was asking for help in his dealings with Donald MacDonald, who was a carrier. And Alex Fisher claimed that he had made a bargain with Donald MacDonald, in which MacDonald had agreed to transport Fisher's goods to Dundee. So Fisher had finished his show here and was going on to perform another show in Dundee. And he had agreed with Donald MacDonald that his possessions would be transported from Inverness to Dundee at a cost of 6 shillings sterling per hundred. But he says in his petition to the court that he's been ready and waiting, sitting waiting for MacDonald to show up for days. But now MacDonald is refusing to perform the bargain and goes on to say that he defies any power in the land to force him to do what he promised. And there are loads of witnesses called, including various members of the household who'd overheard bits of the conversation and so on, and they all supported what Fisher had said, that MacDonald had agreed to transport Fisher's goods at this price. MacDonald initially denied it altogether, and then he said, probably in the face of all the evidence, that he had agreed, but it didn't count because he'd been so drunk at the time he'd quoted the price that there was no way it could be relied upon, and that there was no way he could honour the price. And if he'd been sober, he never would have said it. But the court ruled in Fisher's favour. He ruled that the agreement was valid, and regardless of whether he'd been drunk when he said it, he had said it. And therefore, MacDonald had to either honour the price or pay Fisher's costs to get another carrier to transport the goods. The other reference to a comedian in the borough papers dates from 1785, so roughly around about the same time. And the comedian in this instance is a William Biggs. And in this instance, he is the victim, not the victim, sorry, but he is the accused. In this instance, the petitioner, and it's another MacDonald, but it's Thomas MacDonald, a vintner, so someone selling wine and alcohol. He claims that William Biggs, the comedian, owed him the sum of £4 16 shillings on account. So effectively, because he's a vintner, this comedian owes him a bar tab. But he's worried because he has been credibly informed and has good reason to believe that William Biggs is about to leave the country and is preparing to set off without making the payment to him. And that he, MacDonald, is therefore at risk of losing the sum of money promised to him. He asked for Biggs to be apprehended and brought into the toll booth until they can be sure that he will pay what he owes. And the court double checks this. So they call in MacDonald again and say, is your information sound? Are you absolutely sure that he's about to leave without paying? And he says, yes, I'm absolutely sure. I've got it on reliable information. And so the court does issue a warrant for Biggs's arrest. And it's interesting that no crime had been committed there. There's just the belief that a crime might be committed, and that's enough for him to pull them in. Also, I was kind of laughing to myself when I was reading it that it was another a Biggs on the run. It's not that common a name up here, so interesting. So those two papers both give insight into the legal system, but also a wide range of other things. So you get an idea of the cost of carriage, you get an idea of the way deals were struck, because we hear that people were going into each other's house negotiating a price, an idea of social life and entertainment, and an insight into the fact that both of those comedians were moving, they're traveling for work. Is it a coincidence that both the cases of comedians revolve around alcohol? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I'm certainly not going to blacken the name of comedians, but it was interesting to me that they were both, one was agreement made when they were drunk, and the other one was about paying of a bar tab. So I think you get an idea of These court papers are not dry. They're giving you a real insight into life and existence and what's happening in the area. Another document from the Borough Court records that I wanted to share with you is the story of Lawrence O'Neill, Edward Kelly, and Peter Dennons, who were put into the toll booth having been taken up by the police officers and constables about 1 o'clock on Sunday morning, June the 1st, 1821. And they had been taken up by the police for fighting and rioting on the streets and being vagrants. On being examined by the magistrates, they admitted themselves to be such, so they confessed that they had been rioting in the street, and in order to prevent further trouble to the court, they consented to be banished from the borough for 3 years. The document goes on, as so many of them do, to say that if any of them returned within that time of their banishment sentence, they would be taken up and imprisoned within the toll booth of Inverness, therein to remain until the following Friday, when they would be taken out of the toll booth and publicly whipped through the streets by the common executioner at the usual hour, and receiving the usual number of stripes on their naked backs at the usual places. And one of the things I find a bit kind of, not chilling is too strong a word, but just noteworthy about this is they'll be publicly whipped through the streets on their naked back at the usual hour, at the usual places, usual number of stripes. So it's just such a routine thing to be happening in the borough. There's a normality to it and a standard to it. And that is very much something that we see a lot across these court papers, that the humiliation is an aspect of punishment, that you will be put in front of the public and you will be publicly humiliated is the punishment. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. In that instance of those 3 men, they have signed with a mark as well, so you can see their cross on the document where they have signed. Now that's a relatively small crime. They're fighting in the street. But there are instances in the borough courts of more serious crimes, and glimpses into something that I've referred to in previous episodes, specifically looking at mental health records, which is the role of the court in trying to manage, for want of a better word, those with mental health issues in the past. And I know I've spoken a lot about that before the mental health system that we would know today was in place, the courts had a role, as they still do to some extent, in managing that. And an example of that in the Borough Court papers is the case of Margaret Munro. And so this is her story. In the year 1797, Margaret Munro from the Cars of Ardasir had a charge brought against her for theft, assault, and arson. It was claimed that she had stolen a silver tablespoon, a suit of a man's clothes, and other articles of value from the widow of the late Alexander MacWatt Masson in Nairn, a stock of bees, and a considerable quantity of honey belonging to James Grant in the Cars of Ardasir. Also, a parcel of earthen peats from the property of Alexander Faulkner. So she's stolen a range of things from various different people. Margaret was also accused of having beaten, bruised, and wounded both her mother, Marjorie McBain, and her father, John Munro, to the imminent danger of their lives. Interesting there, the use of Marjorie McBain and John Munro. So up until relatively recently, women in Scotland still went by their own name. So she has committed these thefts. She's also committed this assault on both parents. It was also claimed that she set fire to a kiln belonging to James Grant, the dwelling house of her father, John, and other houses in the parish. So theft and assault and arson. So something quite substantial for the borough court to be dealing with, and also that it's not happening within the royal borough is interesting. It goes on to say Margaret was incarcerated in the toll booth in Inverness, which appears to have made her emotional state worse. Her cries and noise were said to have alarmed the inhabitants of the town day and night, and as a result she was released into the care of her father in Ardasir as the best place for her own health. But sadly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, her father made a petition on the 16th of February 1797 to have Margaret re-imprisoned as she was furious and insane, and he needed to put her back into prison to prevent his own distress, and also for her to receive assistance from any physicians who might be able to help. And we don't know what happened to Margaret Monroe after this. We have no further information about her. But it's an interesting example of a link between a mental health issue and then an act that she had undertaken. And the fact that at that point there was, if this had happened 80 years later, then we would have had a whole asylum system in place to look after her. But at that time, they didn't have that. So you can find these stories within the court records as well. Finally, the last one I want to tell you from the Borough Court is one of my favourite finds to date. I only came across this a couple of days ago, and my colleagues will testify, I was running at them going, guess what I found? Which is something I do most days, to be fair. This is one of my favourite finds. It's from 1821, and it's the case of 17-year-old Alexander Mackenzie. It was alleged that on the afternoon of Monday, the 17th day of September current, Alexander Mackenzie, son of Alexander Mackenzie, confectioner on Castle Street of Inverness, went into the close belonging to Phineas Mackintosh, Esquire, on the same street, and fired a skyrocket, or some other combustible to the petitioner unknown, or a loaded pistol, to the great terror and alarm of Mr. Mackintosh and some friends who happened to be his visitors on that day, particularly to the alarm of some of the ladies who were of the party, and also endangering the premises from fire. And the reason I loved it when I came across it was I was just like, a skyrocket? He fired a skyrocket? What? So the magistrates granted warrant for Mackenzie to be found and brought into the toll booth. So they said that, yes, we should find out more about what happened. And I think you have to feel for the lad. He's 17 years old, which admittedly is, completely being treated as an adult at this stage. But when he was questioned, he said that, yes, on the night of the 17th, at about 10 o'clock at night, he put a small quantity of powder, less than an ounce, so presumably gunpowder, into a paper and put a fire to it on the pavement on or near the front of the shop occupied by Duncan Robertson, merchant in Castle Street of Inverness. He said that it then exploded and gave a loud retort, pretty much the same as the report of a pistol. Again, I thought that was a very interesting phrase. Pretty much the same. It sounds such a modern way of saying something. So he says it gave a sound very much like the sound of a pistol. But he said he didn't dread any mischief or bad consequence because he was just playing. He was just being mischievous. He noted that there were several other young people along with him at the time, particularly his youngest brothers and Mr. Robertson's shop boy, Thomas Stewart. And then the poor soul was given a fine of £1 11 shillings and 8pence, which is around about £100 today, or the equivalent of 10 days' wages. And he also had to keep the peace for 12 months. But at 17, he was held in the prison until he could afford to pay that fine that was the equivalent of £100. But yeah, a skyrocket. I don't come across that often in the 1820s. I'm not going to talk about the Sheriff Court papers today. I have touched on them certainly in the past, and doubtless I will again. I've talked about them with respect to various things, but notably the Highland dress warrants, which if you follow our Facebook page, normally you'll have seen that post a couple of days ago about people being taken into the Sheriff Court for wearing Highland dress. So I'm not going to look at the Sheriff Court today, that sort of intermediate court above the borough and below the High Court. But I'm going to come on to look at the High Court next. The High Court in Scotland was established in 1672. It's the highest level of criminal court and deals with the most serious crimes. So the High Court deals with crimes such as murder, heresy, rape, treason, those kind of very serious and substantial crimes. And as a result, they have some of the most serious power to issue some of the most serious punishments. So the High Court records that we look after hold multiple examples of the death sentence, of a sentence of banishment as well. So as you might imagine, there are some fairly traumatic things within these records, and it's noteworthy that even though they are several hundred years old, you don't stop having a connection to them, and you don't stop pausing to think. There's a lot of child murder in these. There's a lot of assault, a lot of what was called heimsukken, which apparently is still a legal term used, which means premeditated assault within someone's own house. So there's some serious cases within the High Court records. So I'm going to look at a couple of documents from within this, but nothing too traumatic. First of all, the 1811 case of Mary Macmillan. Mary Macmillan was the spouse of Ewan Macmillan, residing in Fort William or Gordonsborough, both names given in the document at that time, in the parish of Kilmally, county of Inverness. And she was accused of the crime of seducing or enticing persons to steal, particularly those of immature age, and of the crime of resetting, which was receiving the goods that had been stolen by such persons, knowing the same to have been stolen in that manner. So basically, she, I just picture her as Fagin, really, from Oliver Twist. 1812, Fort William. Oliver Twist was published in the 1830s, so we're looking at the same sort of time. And this is someone who is actively recruiting people of immature age, so children, to steal, and then is reselling those, receiving and reselling those items. There's no more information within the document about how she got the children to steal. We don't know if they were pickpocketing, if they were going in through windows, again, like Oliver Twist. But what we do know is that she was found guilty and was sentenced to 6 months in prison. One I found sad, and you have to imagine me when I'm doing this one, I'm standing in our strong room looking up at thousands and thousands of these documents to look for specific examples to share, which is why I always say I'll never run out of Learn with Lorna's, because there's just so many stories within the collections. But one I found sad when I came across it was the case of Isabel Ross and her sister Christian Ross of Culcairn in Rossshire. And this case is from 1773. Christian and Isabel were tried at the assizes, Christian for stealing meal and Isabel for receiving the meal that Christian had stolen. And they were found guilty by one voice. So obviously everybody who was there in one voice found them guilty. Now, obviously, I don't know the circumstances about this. I don't know how much meal was stolen. I don't know anything about the circumstances of it. What I do know is that I've spoken a lot over the past year about hunger, about grain riots, about sometimes people being desperate for meal. So I don't know why they stole it, but and that's something we always have to resist in our job is to try and read too much into things. But what I do know is they stole something, and they were sentenced in this way: to be banished to one or other of His Majesty's plantations in America for the space of 14 years from this date. They were to be carried from the bar, so taken from the bar, back to the toll booth of Inverness, therein to be detained until Patrick Cahoon, merchant in Glasgow, contractor for the transportation of convicts, shall find a proper opportunity for their transportation as aforementioned, as after mentioned, and so soon as the said Patrick Cahoon shall find such opportunity at any port in Scotland. Lord Colston, who's one of the Lords of Justiciary, it says they're to be held in the toll booth of Inverness until Patrick Cahoon has a space on a ship to transport them to America. And Lord Cahoon, one of the Lords of Justiciary, grants warrant to the magistrates of Inverness and the keepers of the toll booth to deliver over the persons of the said Isabel and Christian Ross to the Sheriff Depute of Invernessshire or his substitute. And it says, so when they have a space on a ship to transport them, at that stage, the Sheriff of Inverness or the Sheriff Depute or the substitute has the authority to transmit them under a sure guard to the next adjacent shire, and so on from shire to shire until they're taken to the port of transportation. So each county sheriff can take them to the next county boundary and then they'll take control of them under guard and transport them. And that way they would get their way all the way down the country. And it says they will do that until they get to the port of transportation. They are to be imprisoned until delivered over by the sheriff at the transportation port to the said Patrick Cahoon or any person having his orders. So they'll then get handed over to the people responsible for transporting convicts. And then when they get to the port of arrival, there will be a certificate sent back to Inverness to say that they've been received. They were also given the warning that if they returned to Inverness within those 14 years, they would be publicly whipped on their naked backs through the streets on market day and sent back to the plantations again. It seems very unlikely to me that if they were in a position to be needing to steal meal, that they would have any kind of ability of getting back from America anyway. And in fact, another document I found very moving was the case of Donald Reach Macmillan, alias Cameron, and Neil Roy Macmillan, alias Cameron. And that's from 1752. They were in prison for stealing a cow and for being persons of bad fame. And the document in that instance is a petition written by the prisoners themselves requesting that they're banished. So get your head around that for a wee second. They describe themselves as your unhappy petitioners. We are so miserable. And they say that they hope, please can you banish us to another country, as we hope that we may prosper in a foreign land better than we have ever been able to do at home. So these documents give an interesting insight into the practicalities of transporting people, about how people were put in prison and where the manner that they were moved around the country. So Isabel and Christian Ross being passed from county to county until they get to the port with capacity to transport them. And also, as I said, that information about the paperwork that was required in the system, there was an accountability about sending them away. In those particular instances, the prisoners were transported through Scotland to the ports. But there are examples in our collections as well of people being taken the length of Britain and put on the prison hulks at Woolwich on the Thames. Now, it's funny, there are a couple of things I have connotations with despite never having lived through them. One is the sound of an air raid siren, which brings me into panic, even though I never lived through that at all. And another one is the image of the prison hulks on the Thames. I think I probably read too much Dickens. Great Expectations was one of my first full-length books I read at primary school, and it was that image of Magwitch and the prison hulks and the mist on the Thames. It really conjures up an image, I think. And so when we look at these documents and we see people from Inverness being sent there, it's very, very evocative, I think. But you'll know me by now that I have that kind of imagination, which is both a good and a bad thing. There's great detail in these. And so in the case of, for instance, Donald Ferguson and John Hay in 1838, they were escorted from Inverness Tollbooth to Cromarty to be put on the fishing smack Caledonia and then handed over to the guards of the Woolwich prison hulks. So again, another bit of insight into some were being transported down the country, some were being taken north from here to Cromarty, put on a ship and transported to London onto the hulks. And one of the things I love to try and do, and again, you'll know this by now if you know me at all, is to put all these themes together and all the things that are happening at the same time and try and conjure up that picture in your mind. We've spoken over the past year and a half about churches, about Alexander Ross building buildings, the Education Act, markets, politics, and that image of all of these things are happening at the same time. You're walking down the street and you're seeing people being whipped on your way to the market. And that's the real joy of working with these collections, is you start to build up a very 3D picture in your head. I wanted to finish with a document from a different type of court, the JP Court, the Justice of the Peace Court. Again, these tend to be more minor crimes, such as breach of the peace, non-payment of excise duty, and so on. But I wanted to share with you JP 36, which is from 1827, and is entitled Information by Robert Stewart, Commander of the Atlanta Excise Cutter, against Anne and Mary Fraser, Mary Cameron, and Anne MacDonnell. And as you'll know, my colleague is called Anne Fraser. So every time I see something with an Anne Fraser, I think, oh, I need to look it up so I can talk to her about it. It turns out that these 4 women had been caught red-handed in this way. So I will read the extract. On the night of the 22nd of January, 1827, between the hours of 11 and 12, Lawrence Stewart, second mate of the above-named cutter Atlanta, fell in with 4 women, viz. Anne Fraser, Mary Cameron, and Anne MacDonnell, carrying each 1 cask containing between 3 and 4 gallons of smuggled whisky on the highway, which was seized by the said Lawrence Stewart, the above-named women being taken prisoner by the second mate and his party. Warrant is therefore humbly craved for the commitment of the bodies of the said Anne Fraser, Mary Cameron, and Anne MacDonnell to the county jail at Inverness. So they are, they've been literally caught with the smuggled whisky in their hands by the second mate of the excise ship. When you go into the document, it gives a little bit more detail about the women. So it says Anne Fraser resided in Black Park, Muirton. She was the spouse of Alexander MacDonald, crofter there. Mary Fraser, the spouse of Colin Chisholm, residing at Black Park. Mary Cameron, residing at Clachnahary. And Anne MacDonald, residing at Skirgui of Muirton. So again, a lot of information that if you were tracing your family history and you've got people in and around the area at the time, absolutely worth looking in the court records. You never know what you might find. They were found guilty by their own confession and presumably by the fact that they were each holding a cask full of smuggled whisky. And the GP noted that they had done the crime to incur the penalty of £100 sterling each, which now would be nearly £7,000 each. But due to their immense poverty, he would restrict the penalty to being £25 each. They declared themselves still unable to pay, even though the fine had been reduced to a quarter. And so they were committed into the toll booth, the prison, for 6 months, unless the restricted penalty could be paid before then. So we perhaps there start to see a change in the understanding of poverty's role in some criminal cases, but also there's an understanding there of the fact that maybe these people will not be able to pay, and therefore there's no point setting a penalty that they're never going to be able to achieve. So when we look back over the centuries in these cases, you start to see the changes in understanding. And I know I've spoken about that a lot in mental health and education and so on, but also the changes in compassion around sentencing. So for instance, the use of whipping as a punishment, and I've mentioned that several times, the firmly held belief at the time that the humiliation itself of being whipped in public would act as a deterrent. But eventually it came to be thought of instead as not a humiliation on the person being whipped, but as a humiliation on the community that thought it was okay to carry that out. So the flogging of women, for instance, was stopped in 1817 after one particular case which happened in Inverness. A woman who was named only as Grant, described as a young and handsome woman, was arrested for drunkenness and bad behaviour in the streets. She was sentenced to a public flogging and banishment from the borough. Within a fortnight, she had returned to Inverness twice, and on each occasion, she was re-flogged, re-whipped in public, and re-banished. So by this point, in 2 weeks, she had been punished 3 times for one crime. And the townspeople of Inverness started to feel that this was far too extreme. It was far too extreme a punishment. She had now been physically punished in public 3 times for one thing, but also B, that actually your reasoning for doing it, that it was a deterrent, obviously wasn't really working anyway. And so there was a public outcry, and the revulsion of the people of Inverness was reported in the newspapers of the time and reported in the Inverness Journal. The article in the Inverness Journal was then brought to the attention of an MP, General Thornton, a member of Parliament, and that prompted a discussion in the House of Commons about the public whipping of women. and it resulted in the abolition of the public flogging of women. The punishment for men would continue for several years, but then it was also abolished. So we see through looking at these court records the changing attitudes to crime, to punishment, to rehabilitation, and so on, as well as those glimpses into family history, those glimpses into comedians traveling around the country. Just such a wide range of information to be found in the court series, and I really love them. I hope that you get a chance at some point to come in and look at some of them. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Next year I'm going to do one around prisons and prisoners, specifically about the prison system, so we will come back to the court records. Next week, I hope you can join me. I'll be looking at the story of the Old High Church. So moving from a wide subject to one particular building and the story of that building. So I hope you can join me next week. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you again for all your lovely comments about the awards. We are super proud to have got them. So thank you for joining me, and a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. If you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. If you're having problems with the stream, then please do catch up on YouTube. They'll be on, the films are all on YouTube as well. Thank you.